Good Tuesday afternoon. It is July 2nd. A tropical update coming your way. First, we'll talk about Hurricane Barbara out in the eastern Pacific. Yesterday at this time, it was a high-end tropical storm. Now it is a Category 4 powerhouse. We'll also give you an update of what's going on in the Atlantic in terms of any tropical activity there. Here's the latest on Hurricane Barbara, a Category 4 storm. Sustained winds 130 miles per hour. Now, I want to preface talking about the storm with that there is no immediate threat in the next 5 days at least of impacting any land. The reason why I say at least 5 days is because after it gets sheared apart by high wind shear and after it gets weakened by cooler ocean waters, maybe some of that remnant moisture may make its way over to Hawaii, but in no means will it be anywhere near as powerful as what it is right now. In fact, it's still strengthening. Here's how it looks in terms of the latest numbers here. Gusts up to 160 miles per hour. You see in the last couple frames there, the eye has warmed and cleared out and is very visible on satellite imagery. Now, we told you 130 mile per hour winds sustained within this system. How do we know that, though? We're not out there in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. We don't have sensors out there. We don't have people taking any observations. Well, that answer comes from above, out in space. We have satellites that do that for us, and we rely on those observations to give us an indication of what's going on where people aren't. And on these satellites is something called a microwave scatterometer. Big scientific name, but really what this does is it uses microwaves and measures the reflection and scattering of those waves off of ripples on the ocean surface. So when a storm is more intense, there are more ripples, larger ripples, and then that way we can calculate the surface winds there. So it's basically just an estimate, but those estimates are pretty accurate. So in terms of the Saffir-Simpson scale, how we gauge the strength of hurricanes, Category 1 all the way up to a Category 5. Right now, 130 miles per hour, low-end Category 4, but it is forecast to get winds up to 150 miles per hour, making it a higher-end Category 4. And there are some models, although outliers, that it does take it up to a Category 5 status. Again, right now in the atmosphere, it's in a sweet spot. It has very warm ocean temperatures, minimal wind shear, so that's why it's strengthening so rapidly. In fact, 18 and a half hours ago, it was a 70 mile per hour tropical storm. Within those 18 hours, it strengthened to a Category 4 system. And you can see here on satellite imagery, as we switch up the filter to infrared, this tells us the temperature of the clouds. You see the whites, and even for a little bit of time frame there, you saw some pinks. Very high-topped, cold clouds, meaning those thunderstorms are very, very intense and at very high levels, all completely encircling that well-defined eye as it continues to push its way off to the west-northwest. So what is rapid intensification? Well, according to the National Hurricane Center, that definition is an increase in maximum sustained winds of at least 30 knots or 34 to 35 miles per hour in 24 hours. And we certainly achieved rapid intensification in terms of Hurricane Barbara. Here's another filter on it, water vapor. This tells us the moist air deciphered from the dry air. Very, very moist, of course, within a tropical system, and dry air really at a minimum. Well to the north and east, but not getting entrained within the system. If that was to occur, we would see some weakening. Likely not going to be occurring at least in the next couple of days. So the big question, where is Barbara heading? Well, it is out in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, so we call that a fish storm for now. But notice as it does track off towards the west-northwest, it maintains major hurricane status for at least the next day, day and a half, right up through Wednesday evening before it starts to encounter cooler ocean waters, and also the wind shear will start to kick up a little bit. Both of those detrimental to maintaining a major hurricane or a hurricane at all, and then it does start to weaken off to a tropical storm. Notice back off towards the west there, way past the 5-day cone, is Hawaii. And as I mentioned earlier, maybe if it does maintain some sort of structure, some of that moisture could make it there. So here's a look at wind shear, the forecast. We're just going to let this play on out for the next several days. And you're looking at areas out towards Hawaii with the yellows, greens, and blues indicating areas of higher wind shear. Right now, this is the area where Barbara's located, so minimal to no wind shear at all, which is why it's been strengthening. On top of that, we have the sea surface temperatures that are above 80 degrees Fahrenheit Fahrenheit in all of the shaded areas. So once you get north of there, we start to dip below that threshold, and that is crucial for the development and to the release of the latent heat to power these storm systems. So as long as it dips north of there, it'll encounter the cooler waters and start to weaken. If it stays within that, it has plenty of fuel to use. So Pacific hurricane names. Last time we spoke last week, we were talking about the season just getting underway with the development of Alvin that eventually made it up to a Category 1 hurricane. Now we're up to Barbara, the second storm of the season, Category 4 right now. Now, in terms of the second hurricane of the season, we're a little bit ahead of schedule here when we look at climatology from the National Hurricane Center. From 1966, well, the satellite era, up until 2009, typically we see the second hurricane around July 14th. So since it developed yesterday on the 1st, about 2 weeks ahead of schedule. Now let's talk about what's going on in the Atlantic. I really don't have much to update you on because it's been very, very quiet since the development of Andrea back on May the 20th. Here we are July 2nd, and we're just starting to see that increase in activity as we get closer to the peak of the season, which is September 10th. End of July, August, and September, markedly more active. Out there right now, not much at all. Here's the overall look at the Atlantic Basin. Not much to talk about. However, a few areas that I'm going to keep an eye on. Typically, we like to look at tail ends of cold fronts, especially as the bottom half dips into the tropical Atlantic. And we like to look at this area here that could spin up a little bit of a sneaky tropical wave. So keeping an eye on that area here north of Puerto Rico by about a couple hundred miles. And another tropical wave streaming out of the Bay of Campeche moving north towards the Gulf Coast of Texas. No real associate or organization, I should say, with this, but it will bring some pretty good moisture over towards the Houston area. So we'll keep an eye on that as well. Not expecting that to develop. Now, the Gulf of Mexico overall extremely warm, and these numbers are already above average. You need 80 or warmer, and all of these readings are around 80 to 85 to 89 degrees off the coast of Florida. So plenty of energy here within that. Here's another look at the Atlantic Basin in terms of water vapor imagery. We looked at that when we were looking at Barbara, the dry air and the warm air. Now, still very hostile environment out here in the Atlantic. Notice the yellows and oranges indicating the dry air, the Saharan air layer, the dust coming off of the Sahara Desert in Africa, still in play. Down to the south here, a few tropical waves coming off the coast of Africa, but they're not going to survive long with all this dry air. So it's going to take some time to things to kind of evolve a little bit and make it a little bit less of a hostile environment. That's your latest update on the tropics. We'll keep an eye on Hurricane Barbara out in the Pacific, but again, no threat to any land. If you have any questions, you want to reach out on social media, you can find me on Facebook, meteorologist Tim Pandages, or on Twitter, 13 Tim Pandages.